Hello. I am here to talk to you about democracy. I'm here to talk to you about democracy and open source. Specifically, I'm here to talk to you about democracy and open source and the open source database Postgres. My name is Bruce Momjian. I'm an EnterpriseDB employee, Postgres Core Team Member, someone who's been involved with Postgres for 23 years. My goal today is to talk to you about an age-old question that I'm often asked. How does open source development work? Why does it work? And how does an open source project with no assets produce software that's in many ways superior to that produced by billion-dollar companies? It's a pretty complex set of questions. It's hard to answer. But I think, based on these slides and based on what I'm going to tell you in the next 45 minutes, I think you'll have a better grasp of exactly what those answers are. We're going to start talking about governance, the history of governance. There's actually quite a bit of history that even I wasn't aware of until I started working on this and researching it. Then we're going to talk about the strengths of each governance structure. And then to get more detailed, we're going to talk about the messiness of democracy. I know we've all sort of seen some examples of that. I'll give you some more. But democracy can be messy. But then we'll also talk about the ultimate success of democracy. It isn't always a straight line, but there are some very interesting indicators that say that democracy has been on the rise and is on the rise for decades. Finishing that section, we'll talk about software governance, how that relates to actual governance structures, okay? And finally, to get to the real point, having covered all this material, where does that leave Postgres as an open source database? I think you'll find the connection surprising. And then we'll talk about democracy in action. I'll give you a bunch of very specific examples of Postgres working powerfully in a democratic way and why that structure is so superior. So let's get started. This is a very interesting photo. I wasn't aware that there actually was a place that democracy started. I just thought it was a thing, right? But as you may know, democracy started in Athens, part now of current Greece, okay? And this hill, Pink's Hill, is actually the place that the first democratic structures began. Very interesting. Did not know that was a thing. But hopefully someday I'll get to see it. So let's talk about two sets of governance structures. We're going to start with the oldest one, and that one is autocracy. Sounds harsh, but autocracy is definitely a legitimate government structure. It is the oldest. It's basically a case where you have a single person or a small group of people who are in power. There are some examples here. Syria, I think, is a good example. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. Another example of sort of an autocratic system. Communist systems often end up being autocratic. Okay? And again, it is the first governing structure. Democracy or representative democracy, again, started in Athens. Historically, it was only a small group that could actually take part in this democracy, mostly wealthy landowners, okay? And it wasn't technically a democracy, it was a representative democracy. So you elected representatives, and those representatives represented you in making decisions. So it's not a pure democracy. The United States, for example, is a representative democracy in almost every measure. Very rarely do individuals make direct voting on policy. You normally vote representatives in. Okay. I kind of like this slide. You notice here on the left, there's a sort of cylindrical structure that obviously is in poor repair. I'm going to show you a cylindrical structure later in the slide, so just remember that kind of case there. But this is actually a castle in Wales, obviously a good representative of sort of the autocratic structure that was prevalent at that time. Oops, sorry. So, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each structure. Autocratic structures are really good at focusing a fixed amount of resources on a clear goal. Okay? Now there's two qualifiers in there. The idea that the resources are fixed and that the structure of the government really doesn't influence what size of the resource. It's a fixed thing. And secondly, the goal is clear, which means you've defined the goal, you know exactly where you're going, and you don't have to adjust the goal as you're going. You kind of know where you're going, okay? And you might think that even in the United States, there's really, everything is a democratic structure. There's no really autocratic structures. Kind of, I don't know. Space exploration, for example. Think of NASA going to the moon. We didn't really have people voting on what type of rocket to use or what type of nozzle to use. It was pretty clear. The United States put huge amounts of resources in going to the moon, and engineers worked on it, okay? Huge amount of resources, very clear goal, we want to go to the moon, okay? Autocratic structures are very good at sort of funneling that energy on a very clear direction. You know, the execution of war, military, you know, that I've heard sort of people, you know, oddly say that it's kind of odd that you have a country like the United States that prides itself on its democracy or representative democracy, really run by, really defended by a military that is a very hierarchical, non-democratic structure. So again, there are strengths to autocratic systems, again, when you have a clear goal and when you have a fixed number of resources, okay? Democracy's strengths, and these are pretty big. Democracy allows the rapid adjustment for unclear goals. So it's not like going to the moon. Maybe you're building a product, maybe you're trying to provide a service, all these other things. In these things, when the goal is not clear and you're having to sort of wake up every day to say exactly what am I going to do today, an autocratic structure where all the decisions are made at the top, not so good. One of democracy's strengths, actually, and this relates to open source I'll talk about later, is the concept that democracy emboldens talent to act near the problem. Think of a problem, instead of the problem having to be funneled all the way up an autocratic structure for a decision to be made, and then funneled all the way back down again for some kind of action. In a democratic structure, normally the participants are enabled to act at the site of the problem. They have the most information. They're, because of its democratic structure, they have the ability to act very quickly, okay? Another great thing about democracy is it expands the pool of talent. I don't know how many of you have sort of been dragged to an event you didn't want to go to, or had to work on a project that you hated. You know, if you don't really feel emboldened, if you don't feel like I'm part of this project, it's really hard to get excited about it. But if you're part of a government structure or part of a project where you feel like you're part of it and your input matters, then you're much more emboldened to get involved. And that's actually, again, to foreshadow one of the things that open source does really well. Examples of democratic strengths would be consumer goods and software. Consumer goods and software, two areas that, for example, the Soviet Union always had trouble with. They had no trouble with military and space. They did really well because, again, that was a clear goal. But things like consumer goods and software, where you're really not sure what the solution is every day and you're having to adjust all the time, autocratic strengths, they're never going to really work there, okay? So, I've said all these wonderful things about democracy, but in fact, it can be messy. This is actually a protest at the Wisconsin State House, if you're curious. So, efficiency democracy. It unleashes a flurry of activity. flurry of activity because individuals are enabled to have personal power. And that personal power has a tendency to sort of be an engine in almost every environment. And of course, if the solutions are unclear, you have the fluidity of being able to adjust in a democracy that's very hard to do in an autocracy. Think of, for example, many communist governments have 5-year plans, right, where you decide for 5 years what you're going to do. Kind of hard to do. You don't really do that in a democracy. Because the messiness democracy basically makes it hard to predict behavior. Like you don't know, yes, there's an executive branch and they have some plans, but then Congress has some plans and local governments have other plans, and it's always changing, it's always fluid, all right? That's great, unless you have to go through, unless you have a clear goal and then it gets in the way, okay? Problems can get stuck. Problems can be unsolvable, and because there's nobody at the top to sort of take charge, the problem just kind of like floats down. It just keeps going, and it never gets resolved. Sometimes it takes years or decades to get resolved. Okay, I think of the United States debt as a kind of problem that we have trouble resolving. I think some would say immigration is a problem we have resolving. So we have these problems because it's a democracy. Sometimes they get stuck. It's often difficult to undertake large projects that span multiple elections because, of course, the current administration knows what they want to do, but the next administration may do something different, right? Again, very hard to have that continuity. Direct democracy actually has some really serious problems. Most of the things I've talked about are representative democracy. But direct democracy even more difficult. For example, California has a number of cases where they have propositions, Proposition 13, Proposition whatever, where they take to the voters something like 3 strikes you're out law for jailing felons who have been convicted 3 times, or a law that prevents governments from raising taxes without having major requirements to do that. And sometimes these direct democracy things can lock the government into behaviors that they can't get out of. And sometimes it ends up really badly because they haven't thought, sometimes the population hasn't thought about what happens. Tim Berners-Lee this morning talked about Brexit as a problem for democracy, right? They sort of threw out the question to the population. They voted barely in favor of leaving the EU, and now this yes or no vote, they've got to figure out what to do with Northern Ireland, what the backstop looks like, what their new relation with the EU is going to be. That's not in the yes or no vote, right? Now we've got this really hard problem, and they're kind of stuck trying to implement it, right? Kind of hard. But the good news is that there is pretty much an ultimate success of democracy. This actually is a protest in Moscow for Alexei Navalny. And again, this is a sort of desire of democracy. So democracy is not a straight line. It's often up and down, but again, there's a definite direction things are going in. But again, looking back in history, okay, first democracy, Athens, we talked about that earlier, right? But actually, democracy in Athens was first established and then suspended during the Peloponnesian Wars, okay? So, not too good, right? Roman democracy in the Senate eventually ends in the Caesars and dictatorship. Also not great. The Middle Ages, it's hard to even say. There's so much history there. Magna Carta, obviously a huge document in terms of democracy in England. The Renaissance, American Revolution obviously brought democracy to the United States. But it was only white men who could vote, and often only property owners, okay? Blacks weren't allowed to vote at that point. Women weren't allowed to vote, right? Again, those were changed going forward, right? Kind of, you sort of think, French Revolution, for example, leads to the Napoleon, right? So my point is that democracy is not going to be a straight line. It's often up and down, but again, there's a general trend. Democracy continues to make steady progress, but again, there's still setbacks. This chart actually created by I think the Pew Trust actually shows the number of people under every type of government structure for the past 200 years. The red area is autocracy. And kind of interesting, autocracy appears to actually have more total population than it did 200 years ago. The green part is democracy. And you can see that, in fact, democracy shows a pretty significant rise over the past 200 years in terms of the number of people who are under that government structure. The yellow, the orange, again, a little different. If you would like these slides, by the way, they are on my website, momjian.us, so feel free to take a look at them, download them if you'd like. This is another graph, a little clearer, I think. At the bottom, it shows you all of the countries under each government structure in 1977. The mustard color is autocracy. The blue is democracy. And if you look at the top, you have, again, in the past 40 years, major changes, a lot more blue there. But again, we have setbacks. It's not every country. Okay? And again, that URL at the bottom, feel free to check that out. Okay? Okay. Did I mention cylindrical buildings earlier? Yeah, this is another cylindrical building in better condition, actually, in Redwood City, California. Okay. So let's bring this idea of autocracy and democracy to software development. Okay. So in an autocratic or proprietary development model, okay, typically executives make the decision. That's your autocracy. Those are the people kind of in charge, okay? And the decisions from the executives filter down and down to the people who actually execute them, okay? They do have input. They do get input in making their decisions, but the input typically comes from sales and marketing. That's usually where most of those decisions come, at least in proprietary software development. And they do indirectly get input from customers, although it's, again, secondhand usually, okay? And what's really interesting, I think, is the decision matrix that proprietary companies use to decide what to do. What am I going to do today? What feature am I going to add? What feature am I not going to add? Okay? Their normal calculus for making these decisions is, if we do this, what percentage of customers will we gain? And the corollary is, if we don't do this, what percentage of customers will we lose? I don't know if you worked in proprietary software development companies, but you don't hear those exact words, but that's always an undertone of how decisions are made in a proprietary company that obviously has to work in an autocratic system, okay? Another interesting aspect is I found that gains of customers is much more potent and sensitive to decision making than losses. That's probably because it's easier for customers to come to the new software typically than it is for customers to leave that software, because you kind of assume the customers you have are going to kind of stay as long as you do a minimal amount, okay? Another question the company has to decide is, do gains or avoided losses justify the implementation cost? So everything that you decide to do has a cost to it. You've got to decide, does this make sense? Does this not make sense financially as a company, right? You can kind of see, that's the big pyramid, right? In all pretty much proprietary. So that's the pyramid of how things have to work, okay? Because of the constraints, because of the resources and so forth, okay? Open source doesn't really have that same decision matrix, okay? It's a mix of democracy and to some extent meritocracy. I haven't come into that, but in general, that's how I would explain it. Although democracy in open source has problems. How do you vote? Like, who votes? How do you figure out, like, what a voting person is? Because you don't have, like, clear membership. Normally, in a company, you have employees and you have people who aren't employees. So you kind of know who's in and who's out. But with a democratic thing like open source, anybody can be in. So who votes? You don't know, right? Sometimes you get too much feedback. We've had a bunch of cases as a project where we basically say, whoa, we're going to create a committee that's going to make that decision, and like they're just going to decide like what color the bike shed has to be, if you're familiar with that term. Sometimes you get too much input, and you have to kind of filter it out and say, well, everyone's giving their opinion, but who really has studied this? Who really has a valid opinion versus I just want it to be red, right, or blue or whatever. And again, it can be overwhelming sometimes. Obviously, as a project, we've had to deal with this. One good thing is that bad decisions in this type of setup are easily rectified. You make a bad decision, people tell you about it, you realize it, you fix it real fast, right? And obviously, when you're dealing with software, that happens more than you would like. There's also a problem with democracy. You have no roadmap because you don't pay anybody. Anyone who wants to come can do work, so how do you know what you're going to do the next month? Sometimes I don't even know. Most of our project leaders don't know. It has to do with what everyone individually is working on because we don't pay them, they don't report to us, it's democracy. Sometimes I'm surprised at some of the stuff that we get done and some of the stuff that doesn't get done. And sometimes I have to sort of talk to people and say, I really would love for you to finish that. And sometimes that's enough, and sometimes it doesn't work, and I'm almost powerless sometimes to fix it. So again, that democratic structure for open source does have some downsides. But the internet, because it's allowing that type of very rapid communication, really kind of fuels a cycle of feedback, a cycle of ideas, a cycle of energy and development and patches and features and bug fixes that's really almost impossible for proprietary companies to compete with. And that's part of the way that open source projects can develop software better than billion-dollar companies. It's easy to share ideas, it's easy to iterate new solutions, and rapid global communication makes that possible. To sort of finish up this section, I just want to show you a graph or a chart. Okay, this is autocratic development. What you see on the left is the development. Happens inside a company. And almost the only ideas that company can develop are the ones of the people who are on the left. Very rarely can a company get ideas or certainly patches from the group on the right, which is your user base, which is huge. But because of the way because the source code is closed, because there's no way to iterate through it, you're kind of stuck there. So again, on the left, you have a very closed system, and its only interaction with the user base is at design time, which typically comes in through sales, okay? And then when they release the software. Contrast that with open source or democratic open source development. In this environment, every single stage that happens on the development side, the left side, is getting feedback and ideas from the right-hand side. Again, this is a graphic way that you're developing something as good as billion-dollar companies, because we're getting feedback every single minute, almost, on all of these stages all the time. Can it be too much? Yes. I have to, a good part of my day and good part of many community people's day is actually reading all those ideas, reading all those emails, reading through and trying to filter it and trying to get the best ideas and move those forward. That's part of what leadership does, is to take that huge funnel of energy and direct it and help it to be successful, okay? One thing I wanted to kind of talk about real quickly is that I've talked about autocratic proprietary development, I've talked about open source democratic development. There is a hybrid. The hybrid is best illustrated by MySQL, MariaDB, MongoDB. And these are cases where a single company controls the development, yet the software is distributed open source. All right? I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I am saying be aware when you are involved in software that uses this hybrid model, it is not a democratic model, okay? The decision matrix is identical to an autocratic system, okay? It really lacks democratic feedback, although there may be some because it's open source, but again, it's limited. It's certainly more comfortable for users who are transitioning, maybe from proprietary software, maybe that's easier for them. So again, just be aware, it's just an example of a case where you're kind of neither one or the other. Be aware that this has some downsides. Okay, so where does this leave Postgres? Like, you know, I'm kind of halfway through my slide, and now I'm talking about Postgres, right? Isn't that something? Postgres eventually wins. And this, again, back to what Ed Boyajian talked about, being on a journey, right? I sort of don't wonder where we're going to end up because I know, looking at those democratic graphs, seeing where the software industry is going, Postgres ultimately wins. But again, there are going to be setbacks, just as I said before. It isn't a straight line. Because democracy in general wins, because it makes better use of talent. It harnesses a much larger pool of resources, a much larger pool of developers than any single company, even billion-dollar companies can create. And it produces higher quality software. And you see this not only in the database industry, but pretty much across the board in all areas of software development. It uses democracy to attract that talent, as I said before. It has a superior feedback and decision-making matrix, leads to success. And again, still you can have setbacks, okay? So again, when we started Postgres back in, I guess, mid-90s or even earlier, open source Postgres was down at the bottom of that red line, but again, as things move forward, we have a very steep growth curve and eventually surpass and have surpassed in many ways proprietary software databases. So, Postgres in action. What I want to do is I want to talk about a variety of things that are part of the Postgres project that are manifestations of that democratic process. And this might seem like an odd place to start, but I believe Postgres Extendibility is a key aspect of the democracy of Postgres. I had a chance to meet Michael Stonebreaker yesterday for the first time, very interesting. And he asked me a whole bunch of questions actually related to, did you keep the extendability mechanism and how did that work for you? And how hard was it to get it working in a production level way? And it was kind of interesting. And he will be speaking tomorrow, so you get a chance to hear him address these more specifically. But one of the aspects of the way Postgres is structured is the concept of extendability. This was, again, really designed back in 1986 at the University of California at Berkeley, where Postgres had this design of being able to be the next generation of relational system where you could add a whole bunch of stuff to Postgres. Why is that an aspect of democracy? Well, in the old days, if you wanted to add a data type to the database or a stored procedure language or an index type or anything that modified the database behavior, you had to basically control and change the core database software. One of the really interesting things that Michael Stonebreaker did was he said, people are going to want to modify this a lot, so we're going to create an external API that we can use to add features to Postgres that doesn't require changing the core database engine, okay? So now we can have all these different project teams working on all these different things independently as democratic projects that don't need the central database engine to change. They can plug into it in a very efficient manner. This, in fact, are the system tables that allow for plugging and changing of a whole bunch of different aspects of Postgres. Another aspect that I think is really key is the way that Postgres is extending in so many directions at the same time. In an autocratic, proprietary system, most software can only improve in one, maybe two directions at the same time. What's really interesting about Postgres, it can be improving usability, cloud, data warehouse, performance, enterprise features, client tools, all at the same time. Very few companies, almost no proprietary companies can do that much innovation in that many directions. Usually they say, okay, for the next year, we're going to do cloud. And then the next year, we're going to do data warehouse. And the next year, we're going to do performance. And then we're going to do big data, or we're going to do whatever, usability. Okay, and everyone sort of, as an autocratic system, focuses on that's what we're going to do this year. Because Postgres has a distributed development model, we've got so many companies working together to improve Postgres every day. When a release comes out, and you look at a major release of Postgres that happens every year, and you look at the features, you're like, wow, there's a lot of stuff going on. And it's not in one direction, it's all a bunch of directions, all at the same time. That is part of that open source democratic model, which is continually injecting innovation into the database. Foreign data wrappers, another feature Postgres has had for several years. This allows Postgres to integrate with other data sources. Okay? In this example, I'm showing an Oracle example, a MongoDB example, and a Twitter example. But in fact, we have over 100 different foreign data wrapper interfaces. And the URL there at the bottom is sort of give you an idea of how that works. Okay? Proprietary databases really, to some extent, don't want you interacting with other data sources because that means you might leave them. But the community doesn't have that concern. So therefore, we just continue adding more and more of these foreign data wrappers. They're all developed independently. So the core project typically doesn't do a whole lot. We've got a whole bunch of different projects who work on, I've just heard of a new one today. There's one company's working on 2 different foreign data wrappers that I never even heard of, and enhancing those. So again, that democratic model where people have a need, they look at the code, they figure out how to write it, and then that becomes part of that larger ecosystem. Another area, the Postgres extension network. If you're curious about what extensions are available in Postgres, pgxn.org, another place where you can go, distributed, democratic. Anyone who wants to create an extension, they can upload it to this website, and you then have the option of deciding if you'd like to use that or not. Again, this is another way that Postgres is sort of spurning that innovation, that idea that we want to open up as much development as possible to that energy that's out there in the world that wants to solve problems and wants to solve those problems using Postgres. Another great example, I think, of democratic model is PostGIS. It's been around for many, many years. It adds geographic information system storage to Postgres, but it is an independent project. It doesn't really interact with the core database server on a regular basis. They use the standard API to add data types, to add functions, to add casts and so forth, and they just plug the GIS extension into Postgres, and all of a sudden Postgres becomes a GIS database. This is a great example because I don't know about you, but every time I have to look at GIS, I get confused. There's a huge amount of mathematics and terminology and complexity to doing GIS. And if we as the database developers had to learn GIS as part of maintaining the server, I guarantee you GIS would not be as good as it is today. But because we have a separate team who doesn't really work in the internals of the server a lot, but they know GIS really, really well, they can work independent of the core database server, but at the same time take advantage of new indexing methods, new features, performance, and so forth. It's really, really an ideal match, I think, and a great case where you have 2 separate projects working independently in a democratic manner, but again, can create something that's much bigger than each project separately. I kind of love this slide This is a slide from the 10th anniversary of the Postgres community. It was taken in Toronto, and I'm kind of there on the right there, younger obviously than I am now. But what's exciting about this slide to me is how many of these people are still with our community. In fact, there's a number of people who are at this conference who are in this picture. I'd say 85%. I haven't actually done the stats, but I'd say 85% of the people here, again, 13 years ago, are still involved with Postgres. Many of them still active in the community. And the reason that speaks to me is because it basically tells me that the people who are expending their time working on Postgres have found that working on Postgres is a very useful thing for them to do. It's worth their time. Because unlike proprietary development and unlike sort of autocratic systems, their engineering skill and their engineering effort is honored and is in ways magnified by being involved with the project. And there's very few places that an engineer can go to be involved to that extent. Because normally, frankly, engineers are sort of put in the background, right? But in Postgres, they're in the foreground. And again, I think it really speaks to how democracy and open source really enables the skills of this team, at that time, very small compared to what it is today, that these people have stuck with Postgres for 13 years and they had been involved with Postgres even years before this picture was taken, because that structure, that democratic structure, enabled them. It gave them agency. It put them in a position where their knowledge and their skill set was used to the maximum. And you put somebody in a place where they're valued and they feel like their input is honored, that person is engaged, that person will stay, because there are very few opportunities for that. I really am at a loss to show you how many projects and how many people are involved with Postgres. We don't have really good stats on that. This is a chart of just all the places I've been, just me, okay? All the places I've been to speak for Postgres. And again, it spans probably 20 years or 18 years since I started traveling with the project. But you can basically see a very, very nice span that's spread throughout the world. My big hole here, Africa and the Middle East. We just don't seem to have enough penetration there. We have had conferences in South Africa. We do have some people working in Kenya and some of these other countries. We do have some people in Dubai. We have a gentleman in Jerusalem who's working very hard. So it doesn't show on my map, but again, we do have coverage there as well. So very exciting. I talked about voting earlier and the idea that Postgres is the democracy. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. Again, democracy in an open source environment where you have anybody who can vote, like how do you figure who gets to vote and who not to vote? And how do you actually create a community that isn't whipsawing back and forth, that has consistency? You don't get into the problem of, for example, California propositions where you lock yourself into some kind of decision on a vote. So again, it's a modified system. We have committers who are actually responsible for modifying the source code. They actually nominate new committers. Okay, so that's more of a, I don't even know how to explain it. But when we nominate committers, we are taking feedback from the community at large. If you go to our website, there's actually an email address where you can nominate either people to be committers or people to be listed as contributors on the web page. So it is something that we're always getting feedback for. The core team, where I'm a member of, there is not nominations for that. For example, we have core team members who nominate new core team members. Does that need to be improved? Maybe, I don't know. How do we do that? How do we figure out who votes for it? We don't know. And maybe that's an area that we need to improve on. Now that you look at it in writing, you're like, that's kind of odd. But one of the key aspects is the development process is not controlled by the core team, and in many ways it's not controlled by the committers. It's really controlled by this incredibly open development process. And I'm shocked often at how many people are involved. We have sort of a feeling like, let the best idea win. I myself, if I post an idea, that idea doesn't have a whole lot more weight to it than anybody who just decides to post. So I don't know about other people, but I'm often overruled. My idea, no, that's not a good idea. We need to do another way. I'm like, okay. Another weird thing is that we have a case where sometimes we're talking about a topic that we may not know really well, and somebody comes from nowhere, and we're like, and knows this topic incredibly well, whether it's security or mathematics behind optimization statistics or Java, bytecode or whatever, and we're like, where did that guy come from? Like, all of a sudden, we've got this person who's an expert in the field, and that person now is driving the whole conversation, and we're like, great. Like, I don't know what, I used to have one guy who used to know SSL, like, at the API, OpenSSL at the API level, like, amazingly, and he would just, like, show up when we had a problem, and he would just have a patch, and we look at it, we're like, okay, does anybody want to make a change? Does anyone want, no, we don't know. Well, he seems to know what he's doing. Okay, let's look at it. I think it works. Okay, we're going to put it in. So a lot of times, we end up deferring to experts in the field. They see us struggling, and they show up, and the cowboy comes over the hill, and we're like, oh, great, this is great. But I think the community does a great job of focusing talent like a lens on every task that we do. The idea of how we enable people, I think, is probably one of our greatest strengths. Okay? As I said before, democracy doesn't have a roadmap. Postgres also kind of doesn't have a roadmap. Individual companies may have roadmaps, but the project itself, not so much. Developers and companies can have their own roadmaps, but again, it's sort of an amalgamation of everybody working together. And I would say that the result is superior to any single roadmap that we could come up with. Being the person who usually writes the major release notes, which typically represent about 180 features or 180 major changes in every release, I'm kind of looking at like, I understand where these features came from, but wow, there's this whole like boatload of things that I never anticipated. And I'm always pleasantly surprised. So I know it sounds scary, but the results kind of speak for themselves, I think. And if you think I'm making this up, there is a website called PG Life. Again, URL at the bottom. And it is a live dashboard of IRC traffic, most recent conference, tweets, blogs, news articles, commits, emails to the general list, announcements, and so forth. So if you want to see that the project in action in one screen, this is probably the best place to go. At least I use it a lot to kind of get a big picture of where the project's heading. And again, it's chaos. Sometimes it looks that way. But again, it's that democracy, I think, in action. Again, it looks ugly. Democracy is a really harsh system, but it's the best one we have. And I think for software in a lot of ways, that's also true. And thank you very much.